Before I begin, continue our story tonight, Abraham, why don't you tell everyone about the great bonus we have for next week?
Yes, so I think we mentioned it before, but we got the confirmation today. We are going to be having a great guest speaker next week. And I think many of you here already know him. His name is Christopher England. He wrote a beautiful book. I have it. Well, I don't have it with me here. It's basically
Land and Liberty.
Land and Liberty. Okay.
Henry George and classic liberalism.
Exactly. How Henry George, the role that Henry George played in inspiring that whole movement that is called liberalism. So Chris is going to be here and he's going to discuss some themes related to his book. And he will do a lecture and then take some Q&As. Okay.
And if you haven't already done so, I invite you to view and listen to the interview I did of Professor England for the school's Smart Talk program.
Good.
Okay, so where are we in this story? And hopefully we'll finish it up this evening. The single tax movement is evolving, of course, and Pennsylvania turned out to be one of the hot spots for legislative action because the single taxers managed to get the state constitution amended to permit the adoption of a two-rate property tax by some of its municipalities, Pittsburgh and Scranton in particular. Well, how does that pick up in the story here? Well, eventually, the single taxers in Pittsburgh managed to take control of the office of mayor. The single taxers there hadn't really given up totally on national politics, but in 1932, they worked to have one of their number, William N. McNair, become a candidate for the mayor of Pittsburgh, placed on the ballot in several other states as a candidate for president of the Democratic Party primaries. Well, what happens to McNair? McNair wins his election and becomes mayor of Pittsburgh. About 400 persons participated in a testimonial banquet given by the Henry George Club of Pittsburgh in honor of the mayor-elect. 3 years later, however, McNair resigns from office. It's an interesting story. 3 years, he's elected, serves 3 years, and resigns. In 1940, he explained his actions to Frank Shotteroff, then the director of the Henry George School in New York, in an interview that was printed in the publication Land and Freedom. And here's what Mr. McNair had to say about his experience as mayor. And as I've been asking, would someone like to step up and volunteer to be a reader for us tonight?
Well, I guess I'll do that.
Marty, you're a good start.
I wanted an excuse for using a soapbox. My troubles started when I started something unheard of in Pittsburgh, forcing tax dodgers to pay up. My law department told me it could not be done, that even if I did foreclose on taxes, the city would have to satisfy the mortgagors before title could be obtained. As a lawyer, I knew this was bosh. I fired the law department. Action against tax dodgers resulted in the collection of $1 million.
Millions of dollars.
Oh, millions.
And it continues.
I found that I had less chance to expound the theories of Henry George in office than when I was soapboxing. The Georgist who thinks he can advance the cause as an office holder does not know that he cannot hold office unless he keeps his mouth shut. If he talks up, it won't be long before he's out of office.
Yeah, it's a reality that he understood, that a lot of people were opposed to this whole idea of collecting public revenue from taxing the rent of land. and McNair in office, even in Pittsburgh, where they had the state constitutional authority and some experience trying to do more, just raised a lot of more enemies, particularly the real estate speculators who, of course, make financial contributions to candidates and to other office holders. So he ends up leaving office. So what happens next? Well, in the movement, what happens next is planning gets underway for much of 1931 in New York City to establish a permanent educational institution, what early in 1932 would become the Henry George School of Social Science. And the school obtains a charter issued by the University of the State of New York. So 1932, and here we are, 2023, and the school is still going strong. A man named Oscar Geiger was appointed the school's director, and space was rented in a building at 211 West 79th Street in Manhattan. The school began with an office, a library, and one classroom, and courses were also offered at other locations. Oscar Geiger's first report appeared in the November-December 1932 issue of Land and Freedom, and he told readers, go ahead, Marty.
It is the aim and purpose of the Henry George School of Social Science to teach fundamental social philosophy and economic truth to those still learning, to those to whom study is still a habit.
Continue.
It is its purpose to send these forth into the world of life and living, into their chosen fields of labor, industry, politics, and education, so fortified that error cannot prevail against them, so prepared that truth, our truth, will through them reflect itself in every field of their endeavor. It is the purpose of the school to create not merely future followers of our cause, but its future leaders and teachers.
Yeah, in a real sense, in my view, the Henry George School was going to do what was not being done in other schools, and that is prepare people for their civic responsibility by giving them a full understanding what the proper functions of government are, and how those functions ought to be funded. So there's a very ambitious mission for the school, and over the decades, of course, the school has reached hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of students have gone through courses and classes all across the United States and some other countries where the school has had a presence. But as we know, that's not been enough. It's not been enough to really create a citizenry that really understands these issues and what to do about them. So politics had to go on. I mean, education was extremely important, and the single taxers at the time, many of them recognized how important it was, and so the school embarks on its role. A year earlier, Percy Williams, who was secretary of the Henry George Foundation of America, had announced the work of the foundation was to be directed toward influencing decisions being made by elected officials on public policies. What the foundation's officers thought of, well, we can't educate everyone, but we should certainly try to educate public officials. They're the ones most directly involved in the decision-making that's going to determine, how our governments function. And here's what he had to say at the time. Would anyone else like to pick up for Marty? Quiet.
Marty, you want to continue?
Marty, I guess you've been nominated tonight.
Well, if no one is willing, I can volunteer.
Marty's still on mute, so I guess.
Marty, unmute yourself. Oh yeah, please. Sorry.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, I thought I was on. As the result of longer experience and careful study of the situation and its various aspects, the officers and trustees of the foundation have reached the conclusion that in the long run, single tax education cannot be advantageously divorced from political expression.
And finally,
again, there comes a call from many quarters of political activity, and the need is recognized for a strong national agency to plan, foster, and support organized campaigns directed toward the practical application of the single tax principle.
so there might not be a political party, but there certainly would be political activism. And in addition to that, there would be a concerted effort to bring public education to the general public through the work of the Henry George School. Well, an impressive group of single taxers were enlisted the next year, 1933, to form another entity, the Henry George Lecture Association, with an office in Chicago. John Lawrence Monroe, pictured here, was appointed director. Remarkably, this activity continued through the worst years of the Great Depression, but ended in 1936. Monroe was in that year appointed director of the Henry George School in Chicago, and the Chicago School became one of the strongest extensions of the Henry George School in New York. A lot of activity, a lot of students, a lot of courses being offered. Well, those who had pulled together the resources to establish the schools could rightfully feel encouraged at the progress made in just 4 short years. The school's educational programs were underway by then in 66 cities, 5 of which were outside the United States, in Australia, Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand. In 1938, the school purchased this large building in Manhattan, where it remained until 1981. And 1981 was the year that I became first involved with the school. So I didn't have an opportunity to see this school, but I understand it was quite the grand mansion. Included large lecture hall. It had a cafeteria for a lot of social activity, etc. But a decision was made at the time to relocate the school to a new location they thought would attract more students, more people, because of day traffic. And that was on the way to Grand Central Station in New York, where that building was located. And that's where I first became involved with the school. Well, from the beginning, the school's program was directed by Frank Shotteroff, a leading figure among New York's individualistic community. Still, Shotteroff fully embraced Henry George's principles and his analysis of political economy. He strongly believed that a full understanding of George required long, serious study. So he was the right man for the job at the time, because he was prepared to give people a very rigorous education. And here's what he had to say about the school's approach. Go ahead, Marty.
Okay. It has been suggested that the school method is too slow, that we should have an abridgment of Progress and Poverty or some other textbook which can be grasped much more easily than this classic. The only reason for substituting another book for Progress and Poverty as a textbook would be that this other book is better, that is more convincing, clearer, and more interesting.
And he continues.
That, however, will be decided when and if the book is written and published. Until a better book than Progress and Poverty appears, there does not seem to be any reason for even discussing a change. And
so in 1980, when I became a student at the Henry George School, the first course, the Fundamentals of Economics, was taught using Progress and Poverty, and it was taught using a Socratic method, where we, the students, were expected to go home and read and do homework and come to class prepared to discuss the answers to the questions that we had answered during the previous time at home. And so it was pretty rigorous, and you really did learn a lot from that process. But not everyone was very diligent about completing their assignments, unfortunately. And that's one of the problems with the Socratic method of teaching and learning, that it does require that that you really do the assignments. And so over time, even when I joined the faculty, I began to resort to the lecture discussion method because I found that not enough people were doing the actual work that was needed. So we all within the Georgia's community, within the political side, the educational side, we've all had to adjust to realities. And so here we are in 2023, we have very new realities that we've been talking about. And a lot of what the new reality will dictate how we reach out to people and how we get them involved, attract them to what's being taught at the school and what's being discussed in the political arena as well. Well, fast forward a little bit. As the year 1941 began, a group of New Yorkers decided the time had returned to make a new attempt to influence legislation at the state and federal levels. This is a document here that was issued proposing the creation of a Henry George Committee for Legislative Action. A pamphlet was produced and sent out to over 1,000 legislators throughout the United States. An enclosed card with the document read as follows. I'll read this. There is an untapped source of revenue which, if taken, would go far towards meeting governmental needs in the present emergency. May we earnestly suggest that you give your attention to the enclosed framework of laws. So what was the result of that? Well, some legislators responded, of course, with thanks, and maybe a few of them were even influenced. But no legislation resulted in New York State out of the effort. Land and Freedom actually contains no further updates on the committee's activities after this November-December 1941 issue. By the middle of 1943, Land and Freedom's own financial condition had deteriorated. A fundraising appeal was unsuccessful, and so publication was indefinitely suspended. How much that had to do with the Second World War and the inability to get people to think about domestic affairs at the time is hard to say. But the school decided to step forward. In September 1943, the school began producing the Henry George News, and that replaced Land and Freedom. The new director, Margaret E. Bateman, who had come to New York from Montreal, provided readers with an update on the school's promotional activities. Here's what she said. And it would be nice if we could get one of the women in the class tonight to read this.
All right, I'm game.
You knew where I was going, Wynn.
Yeah. Actually, I've got a quick comment on the end of Land and Freedom. I think there was another factor related.
Okay.
And that was that American Journal of Economics and Sociology was coming along.
Oh, you're right. It had already, I think, started in 41.
41, yeah. And the funding, it just couldn't go to two places.
Makes sense.
Literature has been sent out this fall to 12,000 libraries throughout the United States. Requests for courses are already coming in. A recent advertisement in The Nation brought us 200 new students. Radio spot announcements were responsible for 600 more.
Well, then in May of 1946, Margaret Bateman reflected on what she had learned during her years in New York at the Henry George School. She was about to depart and go back to Canada. And here's what she said.
Looking back over the past 4 or 5 years, I remember when war was everywhere, when even the daughter of Henry George was wearing a warden's helmet on regular air raid duty, volunteering also in a serviceman's canteen, when the ranks of our teachers were depleted because so many were overseas.
She continues.
When the office staff was constantly in a state of flux because wages were higher in war industries, when many of our friends were working double shifts, and prospective students told us they were actually afraid to be on the streets going to and from classes.
I wonder how many people have a similar feeling about being out at night today in some of our cities. Anyway, she finishes with this.
Those days, thank God, are over. We are heading now for greater accomplishments. We are all desirous of an acceleration of pace, and we are as sure of the school's constructive progress as we are that the buds now opening will blossom into flowers. Our new flower boxes are a good omen. We shall fill them with earth as we go on cultivating the ground for new students here in New York and everywhere in the world.
So I have a number of Margaret Bateman's writings in the library of the School of Cooperative Individualism. And she made some interesting contributions to the literature of the movement. So I would encourage you to visit the website, my website, and look her up. So she returns to Canada, and returning veterans from the war are going to become back involved with the Henry George School, and eventually a new director will be chosen. Well, no additional reports of activity appeared in the pages of Land and Freedom or the Henry George News during the Second World War, really. After the war, the organization issued a proposal for Georgist action now. The objective was to awaken mass public interest in Georgism. So these efforts continue. And here's what it said. Oops, didn't mean to go there. Yeah, sorry, this is something they published as a functional chart of the American Alliance to Advance Freedom. And this is what they had in mind and how this would all work together. And they said, and this is the I guess I'd skipped ahead, unfortunately, inadvertently on the slides. But anyway, here's what the proposal for Georgist action now says. And it includes this passage. We urge an intensification of formal education, but not for the restricted purposes of education itself. The cultural value of learning in economic and social philosophy is secondary in this moment to its value in the active practice of social reform. Let formal education be directed toward a broader purpose, a training of leaders in a widespread movement concretely aimed at consummating the reform we advocate. And that very much highlights what those in charge of the Henry George schools around the country focused on. Their idea was to get people in as students, and as soon as possible get them to become teachers. So the students learning was a big part of it, but also, as all of us who've ever taught know, it is by teaching that you really learn your subject. You can study, formally, you can write papers, but by teaching the material again and again, you really begin to understand how to present it and what questions are going to come up, et cetera. And so that was the philosophy at the time of the people who were involved in the education arm of the Georgist movement. By the time I encountered the Georgist community in 1980, and there I am with darker hair and some of the colleagues, you might know Michael Hudson on the left. The gentleman beside me is an attorney, and then over on the right it looks like a younger Nick Tiedemann. But anyway, by the time I encountered the Georgist community in 1980, most of the political activism in the United States was carried out by individuals trying to convince the mayors and city council members that a two-rate form of property taxation would solve a wide spectrum of urban problems that many communities had been experiencing. And long gone was any thought of building an independent political movement. Where do we stand today? Well, I'm not exactly sure. It's certainly not the end, but it is the end of the story that I have to tell about political activism and a part of the Georgist community. So we have a good half an hour for some discussion. What you've gained from this series of lectures, questions that you have, and thoughts about the future. So let's open it up and let me know what's on your mind and how you've responded to all this. I see Michael's yellow hand up. Michael.
Yes, thank you very much for that comprehensive thing. I think this last session, I'm going to try and look at it again and again, I think, because I think there was some good stuff. But coming back to today, I'm mindful that we have the latest innovation, really, which is the completion of the annotated works of Henry George, the 6 volumes that have now been published, haven't they? That
Yes.
they're there. And I've always hoped and always have the opinion that, this effort by Schalkenbach and others is magnificent in its scope, because it's annotated works and it's adding to it. And I've got great ambitions about this. I think, if we teach, here in London, in the Henry George School in London, we have a Friday afternoon group which basically reads the books, really, but we don't discuss it enough. Basically, I'm a bit critical of our class.
Well, as you know, from time to time, I've had an opportunity to participate, and several others here have as well. So it's a great experience.
Yeah.
The problem, I think, is that people don't have the time today to engage in that way with material. I have no idea what the private sales of the series is. I hope that libraries are buying it and colleges and universities are buying it. And so the next question I would hope for an answer about is, are any college professors, university professors using any of the books as part of their teaching? That's what would really be exciting.
Well, I'll share your opinion, thoughts about that, really, because I don't. The books are very, very expensive, obviously, to buy commercially. We in London have got some copies, and we do issue them to some universities. We're trying to make sure that the people who do receive them at a discounted rate, etc., are actually serious about it, and they don't just take it on and sell it on eBay or something, because they're so expensive, really, to buy. So commercially, and I always think that it's important to support the publishers in getting this out. But it is they are very expensive, and I think, and I really don't think that there are any university lecturers, apart from the people we know, who resort to them in the proper way. I just think so. But it's potentially it's a great effort, because you've got the original words of Henry George, and you've got some very good essays, and you've got the annotations, etc., etc. And it does require quite a lot of time and patience. You can't do it in a simple lecture and all that sort of stuff. Doesn't seem to work, because it takes time.
Well, Michael, you may not be aware of this, but there were several efforts over the long decades of people who tried to start Henry George universities. And in Florida, there was an effort. And it's unfortunate that never succeeded, because it would be great to have degree granting institutions that were teaching political economy and giving degrees in political economy based on the writings of Henry George. But maybe that might be something that is still possible down the road in the future. Marty.
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was an excellent class. Got a lot out of it.
And I thank you for your participation.
Oh, no problem. It was a lot of fun. So I guess I wanted to start by saying that there's a very important period of history, 1920s, 30s, with, you did mention Tom Johnson, Cleveland, and Al Smith, but in preparation for the conference that's coming up in July, I reread the Al Smith story about how he took taxes off of buildings and had a boom But in that article also, they talked about the significance of the person pushing the issue. Is like Mace and Gaffney got into the importance of the individual making that step forward, that being hesitant or maybe want to sit in the background or having an opportunity to do something, but they didn't do it, it makes all the difference in the world. And I thought that was a nice way of identifying some of the problems of advancing Georgism.
Well, some of us are activists by instinct, by our personality, and many of us like to quietly sit in the background and maybe contribute a little bit quietly, but
Yeah.
you know. And then there are others of us who are ready to storm the gates and get out there and march with our brothers and sisters trying to change the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
takes all kinds.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, what if Martin Luther King was just a regular preacher? You know, I think a lot of the advances that were made wouldn't have made. So it required maybe the downfall that he experienced. But the one thing that I did want to mention is that, in my opinion, the biggest mistake that Henry George made was in 1887 when he broke with the socialists, because the socialists were at least on board with him for the single tax, whether they liked it or not. And I think George had an obligation, a debt to the labor movement, which got him pretty close to be, well, essentially close to getting to be mayor of New York. So I see that as being somewhat selfish, that he had this movement and he wanted it not to involve socialists or communists. But I think it was a political mistake to do that, because whether whether it's exactly his or not, I don't think that was the point. The point was establishing the single tax idea, and I think he could have done it through the socialists.
Well, the point that you make is one that's been discussed and debated among single taxers and Georgists for a very, very long time. And some members of the Georgist community felt that George's biggest mistake was actually running for political office, that he lost his status as a philosopher by engaging in the lower level discourse with politicians. So I don't know. I mean, George's story would be a lot less compelling if he had stayed out of politics. But it's part of his life story that's so compelling and interesting. And was it a failure? Well, obviously the story that I told you, indicates that it did not succeed in the way that many hoped. Whether an alliance with the socialists would have had a greater result, perhaps it might have had a greater result by being more closely aligned to the Labour Party in the UK or in other English-speaking countries. But in the United States, it's hard to say, because socialism never really gained traction in America, not even with the labor unions. So for another discussion, Marty, but Bruce.
I just wanted to say that I had sort of a personal connection. My father worked in Chicago for the Socialist Party from like 1930 to 1940. And I guess, it was Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party in the United States. And when the war started, he shifted into the labor movement and worked there for the rest of his life. So I just thought that it was interesting that I don't know, never came up in my family's discussion.
Yeah. With regard to the socialists in America, I remember a quote from Michael Harrington who said something like, it was interviewed and said, why didn't the Socialist Party ever become a dominant, participant in the political arena in America? And he says, well, the Democrats and the Republicans gave us almost everything we wanted. And up until the Reagan Revolution, I think that was essentially the case.
Yes, and as I said, in 1940, my father shifted that. He left the Socialist Party and he worked in the labor movement for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
So,
and labor in the United States was much more directed toward bringing workers into the middle class rather than making a separate political statement as they did in other countries. Victor, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Terrific. Tell us what's on your mind. How'd you react to all this?
Well, I don't understand how you deal with people who don't pay taxes. In the Pittsburgh example, for the one I'm concerned, I live in the Lehigh Valley, which is about the same size as Pittsburgh. And to me, when somebody doesn't pay taxes and gets away with it, it's a sign that they have political power. So the issue to me is very clear. We are dealing with an oligarchy. And Thomas Paine, I don't care what he wrote in Agrarian Justice, his first step would have been to remove the oligarchs from power. Whether you have to join with Democrats and socialists or whatever, it's just common sense. So to me, it's a different issue than the one you're talking about. And you haven't addressed that.
Well, did the single taxers did they acknowledge that the country was dominated by an oligarchy? They felt it was dominated by monopolistic interests, but that the political arena was not really as dominated as one might think, or even maybe it is today. There was corruption, certainly. Every city had its machine, political machine, and there were, all of the graft and all of the kickbacks and all of that associated with those political machines. On the other hand, if you ask the average person living in a city back in those decades, why did they support the political machine? It was because those people at least would listen to you. You had a ward leader, you had a committee person, your family someone needed a job, needed a loan or whatever. And that ward leader, that committee person would be there to help out individually. And so they got the votes. So it took a long time for the people in the United States, and I think Paine would have recognized this, to come to grips with, we have serious systemic problems to solve. Which should be solved first, the political problem or the economic problem? Or maybe they have to be solved at the same time. The single taxers largely agreed that none of these problems could be solved without an educated population. That's why they focused on public education, why the Henry George schools were established, and why they sent out public speakers, because they felt that only by producing an educated public could real change occur.
I don't get it. I mean, you could say the same thing about the American Revolution, whether it was an economic problem or a political problem. And I think Paine would have clearly seen it as a political problem. Until you
with
get
economic consequences. Well, that's for another lecture, Victor.
You're copping out.
Well,
let me just mention that in addition to the labor movement, my father also was involved with the Council Against Communist Aggression. So I believe that there was a view that that there was a campaign, there was a specific campaign that needed to be addressed.
yeah, well, certainly the New Deal, the Roosevelt's brain trust, were people who understood that the threat of communism was real, and that unless they did something to give people hope for the future, there was a possibility of political turmoil. And the question with every political uprising is is the outcome going to be better for people or worse? To answer, Victor's call about, Paine's views, well, Paine was not too sure that the Constitution that was adopted by the United States in 1789 was a constitution that would provide the political security for the people that, that Madison and Hamilton and Jay and others argued that it would. And of course, it took a commitment to adopt a Bill of Rights after the Constitution was drafted for it to get past all the state constitutions in that vote. So it's a story that requires a lot more discussion than we have tonight. But I think what the single taxers were convinced of is that Republican democracy was intact. It was threatened, and the thing that was threatening it most was the system of how public revenue was raised. Wayne.
Oh, yes. You mentioned Frank Chodoroff. Sometimes there is big distinct differences within the Georgist movement about certain issues and people. And I think Frank Chodoroff kind of was a victim of that. He's admired a lot by today's libertarians, but he was also a very strong pacifist, and I think opposed American involvement in World War II. And that was just basically when World War II hit us. I think other Georgists kind of forced them out.
Yeah, well, that happened, I think, I'll give you a similar example. When the British playwright and former MP Francis Nielsen left Britain and came to the United States after writing his book, How Diplomats Make War, he resigned in protest from Parliament because of Britain's entry in the First World War. He came to the United States and was on a lecture tour against war. And as soon as the United States declared its entrance into the First World War, he was forced to shut up. He couldn't get anybody to listen to him anymore. I mean, the time had come to give up on trying for peace. Well, same thing happens, when it comes to the Second World War, and people like Frank Chodoroff, who were pacifists, and we're in the war, and we now have to defeat this terrible, these Axis powers, and it's time for people to be quiet about it. Chodoroff, I gather, was unwilling to be quiet about it, and so those who were in charge of the school at the time decided it was in the best interest of the school for him to be replaced. Joe? There we go.
Thanks.
You're ready to talk.
Thanks so much for sharing more of your encyclopedic knowledge of all these matters. I think it was in this session last week, I pointed out that in our major newspaper, Canada's probably the largest newspaper, Globe and Mail, that a very respected columnist talked about Henry George and the housing crisis, which I was quite pleased to see. And I can't remember if it was in your class or Steve's class, but one of the members here said that they felt one avenue of applying George's analysis was the carbon tax. Was that in this class last week?
I don't remember.
So it must have been the other Steve's class. But I do think that is an opportunity to revive his thinking. The carbon tax works very much the same way. And in Canada, the way it works is that the tax is actually redistributed back to the populace. There's obviously if you're flying in planes all the time, you're out of luck. But for most people, it's simply added up and divided. Let's say it's $1,000 a person, round numbers, then everybody gets $1,000, right?
Mhm.
Back. And at the same time, you're still having the impact of discouraging people from using carbon heavy services and goods. And basically, the land value tax works the same way. It discourages investors from hoarding land and looking at that as a path for good investment results.
Well, Joe,
And,
there are over the length of this story, there have been thousands of people who've gone into their mayor's office, their city council's office. They've testified before state and provincial assemblies. Some of them have even been elected to high public office. And yet the momentum to adopt, to embrace the single tax principles always has somehow not made it over the political hump. What Victor would say is it's because of the oligarchy, and that's certainly a big part of it. But we've always had oligarchs who've become very civic minded and become philanthropists. So ignoring how they derive their wealth, they've tried to do good with it. But only a few who have become wealthy by such means, such as Tom L. Johnson, and to a limited extent, maybe John C. Lincoln and a few others. Have they been able to separate in their minds how they derive their wealth from how they should have derived their wealth, and then gotten on Henry George's bandwagon to help turn things around? So I guess my question, maybe you have a thought on this, is how do we, if we can't dismantle the oligarchy through political means, how do we convince the oligarchy that they should dismantle themselves?
That is, I think it has to be through a better taxation system by the government. But just to get back to my point, whoever it was who said that last week is making an excellent point, that this is proof of concept.
True.
Right.
Yep.
A carbon tax is proof of concept. And the other pressure I would add in some parts of a nation is the extraordinary unaffordability of housing. It's becoming a big political issue. And again, that points right back to Henry George. So, I think there's an opportunity here for revising interest in George.
And I would urge everyone who ever sees this video to take some steps to contact your local officials, politicians, and at least, make them aware that there's an alternative that exists that has positive potential outcomes. There's a long list of economists who've lined up behind the single tax position. And yet there are plenty of economists I hear on the media all the time who have no clue that the land market is a serious problem, that it's dysfunctional, that it causes these cycles of boom and bust. You can listen all day on mainstream television and radio, and you're unlikely to hear any expert raise these issues, even experts on housing problems. Yep. And I engage with them all the time. So we just have to keep trying to do what our forerunners here in the single tax community were trying to do, and see if we can do it a little bit better than they were able to. Jamal.
Thanks, Ed.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I was going to see if I had like a partial solution to how we could spread some of the policies that we've been talking about here. I've been involved in a lot of different organizations in my local community, as well as the national community for Georgism. And from what I'm gathering is that one of the biggest ways we can get a proof of concept is through community land trusts. And what Mr. Dan Sullivan was talking about in the Council for Georgia's Organizations. Is this something that the Henry George School has been looking into with the Roger Staubach Foundation, or is this something that hasn't been looked into by this organization?
It's been looked at extensively. And I mean, we all know, all of us who have been involved with the Henry George community are familiar with the many experiments that have taken place over the last century in community land trusts. Certainly Arden, Delaware, where Win Achenbaum lives and others live, was an experimental utopian community based in part on this idea that land should be held in common and those who occupied the land should pay a ground rent charge, for the privilege, and that ground rent would be used to fund community needs. And the same thing happened down in Fairhope on Mobile Bay in Alabama. And these are successful communities. They've thrived over a very long period of time. The main uses of community land trusts, in my experience, and I work to get mortgage financing for community land trusts in my professional work, was either for the creation of affordable housing, taking the land cost component out of the cost of housing, or for preservation of agricultural land or open space. So the very idea behind a community land trust is to take land out of the market and to take it out of being a commodity. So that actually runs counter, in a sense, to the proposal to collect the ground rent for the community in total, and then possibly share it upward to other levels of government. That's an analysis that economist Nick Tiedemann has put forward as to how we ought to really fund different levels of government, collect the ground rent locally, and then what is necessary to pay for services provided by the next level of government should come out of that fund. So if we artificially limit the ground rent charges less than what the market would bear, then you're basically subsidizing the people who live in the community land trust. Under current conditions, that's a perfectly reasonable approach to take, because we have a desperate need to try to create communities in which people can live, work, and play, and a community land trust is one way to overcome the obstacles of the so-called market system in which we are dominated.
Well,
I don't know, Jamal, does that give you that's my perspective. Marty may want to add something, but did you have anything else you want to say in response to what I just told you?
Yes. One of the things that I've been looking into as a personal project of mine is seeing why did the community land trust experiments of Fairhope as well as Arden weren't able to get to a critical mass to actually have any effective change. And what I have seen in Mr. Dan Sullivan's work is that what his idea is that the community land trust needs to have a profit motive. And in the profit motive, setting aside the profits from the ground rents so that that can be used in order to buy more land surrounding the area. So if we were to add this as, say, something that we could put as an experiment in, say, some area in Appalachia or someplace that has very, very cheap land, would you have any ideas as to would that be effective enough to grow into what we would like?
It's worth a lot of discussion, and there's at least one effort that I'm aware of where a member of the Georges community has land he wanted to donate to create a land trust in a rural area. The problem was finding anyone who was willing to live there. So this is the dilemma, where land is very inexpensive, there may not be the kind of amenities that would attract very many people. It's not like the late 60s and early 1970s where very many people, young people, are interested in living on a commune. But these ideas should all be pursued, and I think the biggest shot in the arm to the perspectives of Henry George is the environmental movement and the realization by at least the majority of people in the world that we are fastly ruining the planet, and we have to do something to return and heal the planet from the impact of human behavior and activity, and that Henry George's ideas could have a very significant impact on that outcome. Marty.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity. I think I like to have Jamal understand that there are several good examples and ongoing examples of community land trust. I suggest look at in New York City. I think in the last couple of years, there's been quite a few established, and the current comptroller, Bruce Ladner, I think, he's a big proponent of that. But one of the economic benefits of a community land trust is that by socializing the land value and making it more affordable, you have this beneficial effect on the housing nearby, which is bringing down the astronomical costs or price of the property, and that alone is a positive benefit. It'd be a lot better if there was a land value tax that would do that, but the community land trust is having that side benefit. Also look at Cambridge, Massachusetts. They implemented a new law and looked like they spent enough time on it to have something successful. So I would say if you want a good model, I'd say Cambridge.
Well, the most successful model of a scattered site community land trust is Burlington, Vermont. And Bernie Sanders was the mayor when that was started. So Jamal, if you want to look at some data, Marty's giving you a couple ideas, and I would check out Burlington, Vermont. And Wynn Ackenbaum will tell us a little bit about the situation as it affects her and her fellow residents in Arden, Delaware, maybe.
Actually, I was headed in a slightly different direction.
I trap you, Wynn.
Yes. At one related directly to the possibilities for community land trusts to help out people now, and that would be existing mobile home parks.
Right.
As you drive up and down the state of Delaware, I've made the drive a lot of times now because we're both in Arden and down in the southern part of the state. Arden is in the extreme northern part, just a few miles from the Pennsylvania line. There is just an amazing number of tiny mobile home parks along a main road, and those land values are going to go up. And those mobile homes are getting too old to be mobile, but they can provide adequate housing. And the areas on either side of that highway are being developed rather rapidly. So that was one thing. But bouncing off,
I would add anecdotally that there's a national crisis in those mobile home parks being gobbled up by investors who are jacking up the ground rents to such an extent that most of the people who live there can't afford to pay them, and they can't afford to pay to have their mobile homes moved elsewhere. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And it would be great if somehow low interest rate financing could be provided so that the owners of the individual mobile homes could come together and form their own cooperative association and buy out the landowner. That's the objective.
Has to happen while the mobile homeowners are younger, and I think in an awful lot of cases they're to the point where they are on a very fixed income, and adding that expense in is just going to screw them up totally. But now bouncing off something that you said a few minutes ago, Ed, I wonder if there's a book to be written showing in chapters by various authors how Henry George's thought can save the environment. And then it can end with a final chapter on what land value taxation itself has to offer to that. But to get it into free trade somewhat, point out that all this, the shipping and all of the airliners are getting their fuel tax free, and the amount of pollution that those are producing.
It would be great to get, a whole team of credentialed writers. Maybe Josh Farley at the Gund Institute at the University of Vermont could take that on as a project. Coming out of maybe a conference, where papers are submitted and then possibly they could be published, and maybe a university press, or even some support from the Robert Schockenbach Foundation. But it's certainly an idea that I think has a lot of merit, Win.
Well, you set that off.
Listen, we have reached the end of our hour. If anyone has a final last minute comment to make, I'll let you have it, and then I'll turn it over to Ibrahima to close us out. So, hearing nothing, I assume that everyone is satisfied that you've gotten out of this series of presentations what you had hoped, and maybe even a little more. And I really thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll be here next week to hear Christopher England, who I think has some really valuable, interesting insights to offer us. Ibrahima.
Can I just
Thank you, Ed.
make one comment at last? There was a phrase here in England very early on in lessons I went to, and it posed the question: it is, how can a nation change its mind? And I suppose we're still struggling with that. There's lots of notions about how it could. Lots of different economists come up with solutions, but it's how does the population change its mind for, rather naively, to be called justice in our economic activity? And it's a big question, and it's I've never heard an answer yet.
Well, since you opened that door, I'll give you 30 seconds of an answer, and then I'll let Ibrahima close us out. It's my feeling that we are born with an imperfect moral sense of right and wrong, and then nurture takes over. It's our biological parents or our guardians, then our family, then our extended community, and eventually it's the nation. So I think we have the potential, Michael, to get it right if we can only get our nurturing right. And the educational work that we're doing at the Henry George School is part of that solution, I hope.
Yeah, I agree.
Ibrahima.
Thank you, Ed, for that's nice closing. This is the end of it for Ed's part, but we are having a great speaker next week, Dr. Christopher England, author of the book that you could see on your screen right now, Land and Liberty, Henry George, and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. So Chris was Ed's guest at Smart Talk not long ago. So that's also posted on our website. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.